far beyond the familiar reaches of human space. On a planet so hostile it was nicknamed Deathworld, a small research outpost was struggling to survive. This remote base was meant to be a symbol of human courage and curiosity, a stepping stone toward understanding the galaxy's mysteries. But the planet had other plans. Twisted forests of razor-sharp plants, skies heavy with poisonous gases, and creatures that hunted without mercy surrounded the outpost like an invisible cage closing in. The team inside was running out of options, their supplies dwindling, their equipment failing under constant attack from the strange, deadly wildlife. Night, day. They sent out frantic messages, begging for help from any ship or species that might be listening. The signal was weak and fragmented, barely a whisper through the dark void of space. But it carried a message, clear as a bell. They were trapped, desperate, and on the edge of extinction. Many races received the SOS, but few dared to respond after. All this planet was known to break the strongest explorers and crush the most advanced technology. Yet, deep in the reaches of the solar system, a group of humans known simply as Earth's Deathworlders picked up the distress call. These were not ordinary humans. They were survivors born and hardened on some of the most brutal planets ever colonized. Their bodies were tougher, their minds sharper, and their wills stronger than most. They had learned how to fight and adapt, turning danger into advantage. For them, this SOS was more than a cry for help. It was a challenge. Without hesitation, the Deathworlders began preparing for a rescue mission. Their ships were equipped with weapons and survival gear, their teams trained for combat in harsh conditions, but the message they sent back was cold and to the point, hinting that their version of saving the outpost might not look like the kind of help the researchers hoped for. Back at the outpost, the scientists and engineers watched the approaching ships with a mixture of relief and fear. They knew the Deathworlders' reputation, ruthless, efficient, and often harsh to those they came to rescue. No diplomatic greetings or friendly offers here. The Deathworlders dealt in blunt actions. As the rescue team neared the planet's surface, thick clouds roiled overhead, thunder shaking the ground, as if the planet itself sensed the coming storm. The outpost crew held their breath, unsure whether their rescuers would bring salvation or something far more terrifying. Harsh winds carried the scent of sharp metal and burning ozone, signals of the Deathworlders' machines descending through the atmosphere. When the ships finally landed, the ground trembled, dust and broken branches flying as the Deathworlders emerged, clad in heavy armor and armed to survive any nightmare this Deathworld could throw at them. The outpost personnel noticed immediately that these rescuers did not waste time with greetings or explanations. Instead, they began to secure the perimeter aggressively, treating every sound in the wild as a threat. The Deathworlders' eyes scanned the forest beyond, unblinking and cold. Their presence changed the fragile balance on the planet. The researchers wanted to believe this was their chance at survival, but as the Deathworlders set their harsh rules, it became clear that help might come at a price no one expected. The brutal environment was not the only danger now. The human survivors themselves were divided, caught between the hope for rescue and the fear of what their saviors might do. The SOS had been answered, but in ways that challenged every belief the outpost held about safety, trust, and humanity itself. In the shadows of that unforgiving planet, a new battle was just beginning, one not only against the deadly wildlife, but between two very different kinds of humans, each fighting for survival in their own way. The moment the Deathworlders touched down, the ground beneath them trembled. Their arrival was swift and without ceremony, no bright lights, no fanfare. Unlike the usual diplomatic teams, they didn't send out welcoming waves or reassuring messages. They simply landed there heavily, armored ships cutting through the dense atmosphere with a low, menacing hum. The outpost personnel watched in uneasy silence as the Deathworlders exited their craft, their figures cloaked in dark, battle-worn suits that shimmered with a metallic sheen. They didn't look like saviors. They looked like soldiers preparing for war. The team's leader, a tall woman with cold eyes and a scar running across her cheek, scanned the area. She said nothing, but the order was clear. Survival was the first priority, and everything else was secondary. For the outpost's crew, who had spent weeks trying to maintain peace with the wild planet and its unpredictable creatures, this approach was a stark contrast. Their hope had been for a peaceful resolution, perhaps a diplomatic solution, an exchange of knowledge or even technology to help them escape. But the Deathworlders were not interested in dialogue. Within moments of setting foot on the planet's surface, they began setting up defensive perimeters, their movements precise and quick. The outpost's engineers, hoping to offer assistance, approached with the best intentions, but they were met with curt commands to stand back. "We don't need your help," one of the Deathworlders growled, his voice heavy with authority. "This place is a threat, and we're here to neutralize it." The outpost's head scientist, Dr. Evelyn Grant, exchanged uneasy glances with her colleagues. They had expected help, but not like this. The Deathworlders were treating the environment, the very land beneath their feet, as an enemy to be eliminated. They didn't seem to care about understanding the planet's unique ecosystem, the delicate balance of life that made it so dangerous. To them, it wasn't a puzzle to be solved or a mystery to be explored. It was a battlefield, plain and simple. They set traps, deployed sensors, and scanned for threats with the speed and precision of hunters. The scientists watched in disbelief as the Deathworlders used explosives to clear a path through the forest, not caring that the explosion would obliterate entire swaths of the terrain, killing anything in its wake. Dr. Grant tried to intervene, her voice shaking with a mix of frustration and fear. "You can't just destroy everything. There are species here that we need to study, that we could learn from. We need to understand the planet's ecology, not annihilate it." The woman in charge of the Deathworlders, Sergeant Rylan, shot her a hard look. "This planet is trying to kill you," she said, her tone sharp, each word measured and deliberate. "We're not here for your research or your peaceful coexistence. We're here to make sure you survive, and to do that, we'll wipe out anything that poses a threat." The cold efficiency with which the Deathworlders operated sent a chill through the outpost crew. The scientists, who had always tried to work in harmony with the planet, now felt like they were standing in the middle of a war zone. The creatures they had once observed with wonder lumbering behemoths, quick-footed predators, and towering insect-like beasts were being hunted down and slaughtered with little more than a shrug. The Deathworlders didn't hesitate to open fire on anything that moved. They weren't worried about the ethics of it, nor did they seem concerned with the long-term consequences. To them it was simple: kill what could kill you first. Team wasn't just clearing out the dangers, they were systematically eradicating everything that could pose a risk. When a massive insect-like creature skittered from the shadows, one of the soldiers shot it down without a second thought, its huge armored body crashing to the ground with a sickening thud. The outpost crew, who had seen these creatures before, knew the creature was only acting in self-defense, a natural part of the planet's ecosystem. But the Deathworlders saw it differently. "This is what you're dealing with," Ryland said coldly, wiping her hands on her uniform. "It's a war out here. It's always been a war. We're just here to win it." Dr. Grant's attempts to reason with them were futile. She could see that no amount of logic or diplomacy would make the Deathworlders stop. Their minds were set, their mission clear. Survival was the only goal, and the planet's inhabitants, whether flora or fauna, were simply obstacles to that end. Every animal, every strange plant, every potentially dangerous organism, whether it was a harmless critter or a towering predator, was reduced to a target. For the outpost crew, this was not the rescue they had imagined. They were not being saved. They were being swept up in a brutal survival game that none of them had asked for. They had hoped for a partnership with the Deathworlders, a way to learn from them, to work together in understanding the mysteries of the planet. Instead, they found themselves caught in the crossfire of a relentless, cold-hearted mission, one that would leave nothing behind except the wreckage of a planet they once tried to protect. The contrast between the outpost's idealism and the Deathworlders' pragmatism had never been clearer. And as the days stretched on, the tension between the two groups grew unbearable. The question now wasn't just whether they would survive, was whether they would survive together. As the days dragged on, the divide between the Deathworlders and the outpost crew only deepened. At first, The scientists and diplomats had tried to work with their brutal rescuers, hoping to build some form of understanding. But every attempt to find common ground was met with cold indifference or outright hostility. Dr. Grant, ever the optimist, still believed there was a way to make it work. "We need to study this world," she urged. "Understanding the creatures and the environment is the only way we'll survive long term." But Sergeant Rylan and her team had no patience for such ideals. To them, survival wasn't a scientific experiment. It was a race against the clock, a brutal, no-holds-barred fight for life. The Deathworlders were coldly efficient, treating every situation like a battlefield. Their methods were swift, harsh, and left no room for debate. They cleared the terrain with explosives, tore through forests with sheer force, and hunted anything that might be a threat without a second thought. To them, the planet's biodiversity was not an opportunity for learning. It was a collection of risks to be eliminated. The outpost crew, once proud of their peaceful exploration, found themselves growing more and more frustrated. Their mission had always been about coexistence, finding a way to live alongside the dangerous wildlife. But the Deathworlders saw everything as an obstacle, something to be removed without hesitation. And as their efforts became more aggressive, the planet itself seemed to retaliate. The once stable ecosystem, already delicate and unpredictable, began to react violently. The ground shook with unnatural force, and strange creatures once previously unseen merged from the shadows, attacking with a ferocity that matched the Deathworlders' own. At first it was small things, a pack of small, clawed predators ambushing the camp, forcing the Deathworlders to fire back in self-defense. But soon, it escalated. A massive, lumbering behemoth, a creature with thick armor and razor-sharp claws, charged through the base's perimeter, tearing down the barriers with ease. The Deathworlders reacted immediately, blasting it with all their firepower. But it wasn't enough. The creature's thick hide shrugged off most of their attacks, and it continued its rampage, knocking over equipment and crushing anything in its path. It was only after a brutal, hours-long fight that the creature finally fell, leaving the Deathworlders bloodied but victorious. But the damage was done. The planet had now shifted into a deadly new phase, and the Deathworlder strategy had only triggered more violence. The outpost crew, who had been observing the creature's behavior for weeks, now saw their worst fears come true. The ecosystem was reacting to the invaders. The planet wasn't just a place of hostile life, it was an active force, a living entity that protected itself with deadly efficiency. Dr. Grant watched in horror as the Deathworlders' methods fueled the planet's rage. "This isn't how we were meant to approach it," she muttered to herself, though no one seemed to care. The damage was irreversible, and now the outpost's survival was in question. The creatures that had once kept to their territories were no longer content to do so. Packs of monstrous creatures, once merely lurking at the edges of the camp, began to mass, circling like wolves around a fire. Each attack seemed to bring more. Each response from the Deathworlders seemed only to push the planet's defenders further into action. It became clear that neither side was winning. At the same time, Rollins' men began to show signs of frustration as well. Their cold efficiency was starting to falter under the relentless pressure of the planet. They were running out of ammunition, running out of time, and their relentless tactics were becoming less effective. The environment, once just an obstacle, had now become an enemy that could not be eliminated. The Deathworlders were used to fighting wars in foreign lands, but they had never fought a war with an entire planet. The outpost crew, on the other hand, had never been trained for combat. Their knowledge of the creatures was deep, but it was academic, not tactical. For the first time, both groups realized they had underestimated the scope of what they were up against. They were not fighting just the planet's creatures, they were fighting the planet itself. The Deathworlders' brutal methods had escalated the problem, and the outpost's peaceful coexistence had failed to account for the sheer ferocity of the world's defense. It was becoming clear that neither side could survive alone, but neither was willing to give in. Their ideologies were too different, their approaches too opposed. However, despite their disagreements, one thing became painfully clear: they had no choice but to work together. The planet wasn't going to stop attacking, and they couldn't afford to fight each other if they wanted to survive. The question now was whether they could find a way to cooperate, to blend their conflicting methods. Before the planet turned them all into casualties of its rage, the uneasy alliance between the Deathworlders and the outpost crew continued to fray. The days wore on, and even greater danger emerged one neither group had anticipated. The violent attacks from the planet's creatures escalated, but now they seemed to be following a pattern, as if they were being drawn towards something. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and strange, unnatural vibrations echoed from deep within the earth. At first, the Deathworlders assumed it was just another consequence of their brutal tactics. Perhaps another territorial creature, or a new wave of predators. But Dr. Grant, having spent years studying the planet's complex ecosystems, had a sinking feeling. She had noticed something she couldn't ignore. Attacks, the strange tremors. The shifting patterns in the wildlife, all of it, seemed to be connected to something below the surface. After a few days of digging through old research notes and satellite scans, she found it. An ancient structure buried deep beneath the planet's crust. The outpost's crew had never picked up any traces of it before. It had been hidden, dormant, for millennia, just waiting for the right conditions to awaken. This was no natural event. The planet was not merely reacting to the Deathworlders, it was reacting to the activation of a long-forgotten alien technology, an enormous and powerful artifact buried deep within the planet's core. The realization hit them like a cold wave. This was no ordinary planet. It had once been home to a civilization far older than any of them had imagined. And this technology, whatever it was, had the power to wipe out all life on the surface. Dr. Grant's discovery sent a ripple of shock. Through the camp, the Deathworlders, who had been so focused on fighting the creatures and securing the perimeter, now had to contend with a much larger, more complex problem. Sergeant Rowland stood at the center of the camp, her face unreadable as she processed. "The new information? A weapon?" she asked, her voice low. "Dangerous? Or something worse?" The question hung in the air, but no one had an answer. The technology was ancient, and they had no idea what it was capable of. But one thing was clear. It had been dormant for far too long, and it was now waking up. The ground trembled again, more violently this time, and the sky above darkened, as if reacting to the awakening force below. The Deathworlders' weapons, which had proven so effective against the planet's creatures, now seemed insignificant against the scale of this threat. Dr. Grant's mind raced. She had the knowledge, but the Deathworlders had the tools. There was no way they could take on this alien technology without combining their strengths. The two groups, once bitter enemies, found themselves at an impasse, forced to work together if they wanted to survive. Dr. Grant and Rowland met in the command center, their eyes locked with the weight of the situation pressing down on them. There was no room for pride or old grudges. "We need to find a way to disable whatever is down there," Dr. Grant said, her voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at her. "It's the only way to stop the creatures and save what's left of the outpost." Rowland nodded, her sharp eyes scanning the data on the screen. "And we need to do it fast. Whatever this thing is, it's accelerating. The planet's defenses will only get worse. We're not just fighting animals anymore. We're fighting a living weapon." The two of them looked at each other, their minds racing. There was a palpable tension in the air, an understanding that this wasn't just a skirmish, it was a race against time. Every second counted. The Deathworlders immediately began preparing their gear, while the outpost crew worked with frantic energy to gather all available research data. They were still enemies, in some ways still distrustful, still clashing over methods, but in this moment, they were allies. Dr. Grant joined the Deathworlders' tactical team, and together they started formulating a plan to infiltrate the underground structure. It wasn't going to be easy. The ancient technology had not only triggered the planet's defenses, but it had also begun to warp the environment itself. Energy fields pulsed from deep beneath the earth, disrupting communications and creating bizarre anomalies on the surface. One of the Deathworlders' heavy machines malfunctioned when it got too close to a crack in the earth, shockwave sending it spinning out of control. "It's like the whole planet is alive," one of the soldiers muttered. But despite the dangers, they pressed on, realizing they had no choice. The alien technology was not only threatening the planet's ecosystem, it was threatening to wipe out everyone, human and Deathworlder alike. Dr. Grant's heart raced as they reached the site. The air was thick with tension, the ground beneath them still vibrating with a low hum. The entrance to the ancient structure loomed before them, a jagged opening surrounded by strange markings and symbols. The artifact inside was a mystery. But one thing was certain: it was not meant for human hands. And yet they had no choice. Together, the Deathworlders and the outpost crew stood on the edge of the unknown, knowing that failure meant not just their deaths, but the death of an entire planet. The weight of that reality hung heavily on their shoulders, but there was no turning back. They had to face this new enemy head-on. And this time, it wasn't just a question of survival. It was a question of whether humanity could live long enough to learn the lessons that the planet was trying to teach them. The final confrontation came as a storm of chaos. The ancient alien technology, hidden for millennia beneath the surface, had fully awakened. The once thriving wildlife, once merely a nuisance to the Deathworlders, now seemed like the least of their worries. The very ground beneath them trembled with an unsettling energy, the atmosphere charged with unnatural static. The air around the entrance to the alien structure buzzed with power as pulses of radiant light shot up from deep below, distorting reality itself. For a brief moment, there was a feeling of overwhelming dread, a sense that they had entered something far bigger than any of them could handle. But even in that moment, humanity's resilience burned bright. The Deathworlders, for all their ruthless efficiency, were forced to adapt, shifting from a fight-for-survival mentality to a tactical approach that combined their combat prowess. With the outpost crew's knowledge, they no longer treated the planet as an enemy to be eradicated. They had learned that survival meant understanding, adapting, and even respecting the world around them. Dr. Grant stood with Sergeant Rallin. At the forefront, her face streaked with dirt, her heart pounding. The Deathworlders were setting up perimeter defenses, but she knew the real battle lay beyond them, in the heart of the structure. "We need to disable the core," she said, her voice steady despite the tension that gripped her chest. "The only way to stop this?" Rallin nodded, her eyes scanning the shifting shadows. "We'll cover you," she said simply, her voice more a command than a reassurance. Together, they descended into the heart of the alien ruin. The air grew thick, the ground shaking beneath their feet as they pushed forward. Strange symbols on the walls flickered with alien light, and the oppressive hum of the technology felt like it was pressing against their skulls. But despite the overwhelming odds, the human spirit, especially the one embodied by the Deathworlders, kept them going. When they finally reached the central chamber, the sight that met them was more than they could have prepared for. A vast machine, its surface covered in alien writing, pulsed with an eerie light. The hum of its energy vibrated in the air, sending shock waves through the room. It was alive. It found it, the heart of the ancient weapon. But even as they prepared to disable it, a violent tremor shook the chamber. The creature they had battled before, the massive, armored beast, now reappeared. This time accompanied by a swarm of smaller, more aggressive creatures. They had followed them in, ready to strike. In that moment, the Deathworlders and the outpost crew had no choice but to fight side by side. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finishing what they had started. The Deathworlders fought with unrelenting precision, their weapons cutting down the creatures with cold efficiency, while Dr. Grant and her team worked feverishly to access the control panels of the alien machine. The room became a battleground, but they worked in tandem, each group understanding that the only way to win this was to combine their strengths. Finally, with a desperate burst of effort, Dr. Grant unlocked the core controls. A series of commands were entered, and the machine began to shut down. The energy fields around them flickered and died, the ground's tremors subsiding as the ancient technology powered down. The creatures, now without their guiding force, fell back into the darkness. From where they had come, the battle was over, but not without cost. The chamber was littered with debris, and the bodies of both the Deathworlders fallen and the outpost crew who had fought alongside them. The air was thick with smoke, and the weight of what they had just faced hung heavily on their shoulders. But there was also a quiet moment of triumph. They had done it. They had survived, not through sheer force alone, but through cooperation. They had overcome their differences, and, in the process, learned something about each other. As the Deathworlders began to prepare to leave, there was a subtle change in their demeanor. Raylan, who had once viewed the outpost crew as weak, now stood beside Dr. Grant in the clearing, a rare moment of respect in her eyes. "You did well," she said simply, her voice softer than it had been. Dr. Grant nodded, wiping sweat from her brow.
We all did. It was not a moment of celebration, but it was one of understanding. The Deathworlders had learned through
hard experience that strength wasn't always about power and brute force. Sometimes survival meant adapting to the unexpected, finding strength in cooperation, and recognizing the value of knowledge and empathy. As their ships lifted off from the now quiet planet, leaving the wreckage of both the ancient weapon and their old ideologies behind, there was a shared understanding. Earth's Deathworlders had come to this world as ruthless, self-sufficient warriors, but they were leaving with something more. They had learned that even in the most unforgiving places, even in the heart of a death world, there was room for change. And that was the greatest lesson of all, one that would carry with them, wherever they went next in the galaxy. Humanity's indomitable spirit, combined with a newfound respect for the unknown, had not only allowed them to survive the planet's wrath, had changed them forever.